Good afternoon. It is the 15th of October, a couple of weeks before a minor election going on somewhere in some countries, somewhere in the Western Hemisphere. And this is the THCB gang. I'm your host, Matthew Holt. Looking forward to having a fun show today. We're going to talk a bit about a lot of different stuff, but I think that election and possibly some Supreme Court stuff might come up in all this. Okay, just quickly, who we got on today? Grabbing her back on the show after a while away. It's great to have Jennifer Benz, communications leader, Siegel Health Communications League. She runs Benz Communications, now part of Siegel Benz. Rosemary Day, it's her second chance. Now you're no longer a guest, Rosemary. You're now just one of the hoi polloi of members, CEO of Day Health Strategies, and author and future THCB Book Club participant. We'll hold on that for a second. My old friend and colleague, John Lee Neptune, JL, who these days is running Suntra Modern Recovery, but has done a bunch of stuff and is the token MD, oh no, not the token MD, one of the two token MDs on the panel, although neither of them have practiced medicine for a while. Vince Corrales from the wilds of Idaho, principal at Better Health Technologies, long-time healthcare consultant technology. Guru Mike McGee, who is on the book club, THC Book Club, coming up soon. We've just taped it. The author of Code Blue, which is a great history of the US healthcare system and his part in its downfall. To quote an old English author none of you heard of. And finally, Devin McGraw. I won't tell the joke about thrusting entrepreneur these days, but Chief Regulatory Officer at Citizen. So we're going to go live, and I'm going to go around the horn and ask everyone how they've been doing this week and the last week or two, what they've noticed. And I know nothing has gone on. We've had a quiet week. No presidents have got better or worse. Or no Supreme Court, a little bit. All right. Devin, why don't I start with you? What do you notice in the last week?
I just noticed this morning that United Healthcare had reported that its earnings were down in the third quarter, which is against the curve of what we're seeing post-COVID with health plans, right? Which we've talked about on other episodes of this. You know, that the COVID-19 has been harmful to practically everyone in the healthcare system except the health plans, but that appears to be leveling off a bit, which is interesting, and it bears the question of whether we will see the exact opposite happen as some of the pent-up demand from the height of the COVID era. Not that we're not still in it, but as restrictions are starting to be relaxed across the country and people are starting to get back to the doctor again, whether we're going to see the health plan revenues go down. So I thought that was interesting.
JL, I'll go to you. Not to ignore the fact that you actually were one of the only person we had on the show who's actually had COVID, and hopefully made a good full recovery. But
I hope you gave him consent to out you like that.
Actually,
he's not covered by HIPAA,
sorry.
but that's confidential
Did I mention that Devin used to run the Office of Civil Rights at HA? What's my fine?
That's all right. You're not covered by HIPAA.
Fine. How many millions is it?
It's Matthew. It's $1.5 million per word. So I think
keep talking.
The show's
Matthew.
declaring bankruptcy. By the way, you can find many episodes of JL on YouTube talking about his experience, which is actually well worth watching. But JL.
So I think what I noticed this week, and I tweeted about an article in Bloomberg about hospital finances and sort of the second and third order effects of COVID. And what I mentioned in my tweet is you have a COVID wave. All of a sudden, hospitals start canceling their margin generating procedures. The hospital finances start turning upside down. And for many hospitals in many communities, especially rural communities, there are hospitals that are going to go out of business, that are going to go bankrupt. And what people don't realize is how important hospitals are as centers of stable, well-paying employment in many communities. And I think that that's something we really need to think about. There are some people who would argue whether we should think about healthcare as a jobs program, but as it is now, a lot of communities rely on their healthcare sector to drive their economies. And COVID, as we approach a second wave or what might even look like a third wave coming soon, could really be impacting the finances of your local hospital or health system.
Jen.
Hi, Matthew. What I've noticed this week is that it's the middle of October, which for my team means we are in the middle of annual enrollment for all of our big employer clients. And it's that time of year when everyone realizes that their healthcare costs are going up more than their pay. And we kind of have that conversation again. So that's certainly a big topic. And I know Jane mentioned that last week with the Kaiser Family Foundation study that had just come out. And then the other thing on that topic and connected, I think is very interesting, are the employers that are doing different things to help their employees vote. And an article came out last week, I believe, about Starbucks is willing to pay for your Lyft ride to go to the polls, which I think is super interesting. Just one of many ways that employers are helping people get out there and vote this year.
Are they going to pay for the 11 hours in line you're spending in Georgia or wherever?
That I don't think so.
That's interesting. Fantastic. Mike, what have you been paying attention to?
Well, this has sort of been a week of grievances as we're approaching the 3-week mark before the election. It was a rough week for the American Osteopathic Association, which since 1965 has had equivalency between the DO and the MD degree, but apparently MSNBC wasn't fully aware of this and began to define the White House doctor Sean Connolly as a almost non-physician. Now, in addition to that, Deborah Birx, for the first time, got a frontal full-on attack this morning in one of the major newspapers. And there has been general critique, obviously, of the head of the FDA, the head of the CDC. And on top of that, yesterday, Nature, for the first time, joined Scientific American and Science Magazine and New England Journal in endorsing a candidate for president. What was interesting about the Nature editorial was the fact that it began with a full-out mea culpa, and they quoted themselves from 2016, basically saying after Trump's surprise election that everything would work out all right because we have many protections within our democratic form of government. And they said in the article yesterday, never could we have believed that we would get this so wrong, and went then forward to explain what a disaster Trump has been for science. So the science community, I think, is struggling to rediscover its voice. A little late to the game, but giving it the good try.
Absolutely. Worth noting that, Mike, you have a piece on THCB this week about essentially rules for journalists to think about how to
Right.
deal in this sort of post-science world or whatever that will be, post-truth world. And Kim Ballard is not on the gang this week, but regularly committed to THCB and often on the gang. Has got a piece about sort of defending science. Rosemary.
Hi. I noticed that in addition to the fact that we're less than 3 weeks from an election, we also had the Supreme Court justice hearings for Amy Coney Barrett. And what I noticed is that we didn't learn a whole lot from the hearings as to where she would stand on things. And so we are, frankly, I don't think much better informed than we were before the hearings. So, you know, where does that leave us in relation to the Affordable Care Act case that is going to go before the Supreme Court on November 10th? It's hard to say. Of course, she would tilt conservative, but, you know, there was no clear path. We all would have to speculate as to how she would rule. And clearly she kept saying everything is case by case and all very careful. I still do worry about the state of the Affordable Care Act, not necessarily it being entirely overturned, but it being eroded. And so from that standpoint, this election couldn't matter more, because rather than relying on the courts to do things for us in the cause of advancing coverage, there is also the legislative branch and the executive branch. So we have a chance to make a difference there. And I'll leave it there for the moment.
I'm sure the Barrett hearings may come up again somehow. Vince.
Hey, I'd like to reference I think, fairly widespread discussion on Twitter that's also largely been misinterpreted. Earlier this week, Seema Verma, who heads up CMS, was asked the question, do you believe or should there be parity for telemedicine? a very poorly worded question to start with. And her answer was interpreted as telehealth should be paid for in the same way as an office visit would be paid for. In fact, the specific wording that she used was telehealth should be a permanent benefit. And there's a distinction that I think people need to become aware of. Parity in coverage is not the same thing as parity in reimbursement. Coverage means the service of a telehealth visit would be covered like an office visit, but it doesn't mean it's paid at the same rate. I loved your snarky comment. I know you were involved in that discussion, Matthew. I'll paraphrase you and say your snarky comment was, "I hope SEMA's not around in January to have to worry about making that final decision." But the broader point I think that we're seeing is that payers are having a very mixed reaction to telehealth and virtual healthcare. And we've already seen some of the majors cut back in co-payments. And if you put yourself in the shoes of a payer, the issue is really, is this a substitute for an office visit, or is this creating new visits that I now have to pay for? And the evidence, frankly, is mixed to date. Now, to connect another dot, or another couple of dots here, there was a large funding this morning for a company called 98.6. They raised $118 million. And what they do, in essence, it's a automated telemedicine, telehealth visit. You talk to a chat box that is empowered through AI, and the doctor's portion of the visit is very short. He's presented with initial findings, and the role of the doctor is simply to validate or have a real human being look on top of that. So the effect of this is, you're going to be, as a doctor, potentially 20, 30% more productive. Or if you're a health plan, you're saying, oh, spit, doctors are going to be billing me for 20, 30, 40% more patients. They're going to have more throughput. So you're going to have a very mixed reaction to that. The headline, again, is I think we need to really be paying attention to how the payers are seeing telehealth. And I think there is a euphoria out there right now, certainly among the virtual care community, but this is not a done deal yet. And I would have a request. I would like to point out somewhere in this conversation, doesn't have to be now, Matthew, but my friend and colleague Devin is a trendsetter, and I'd like to give her kudos for that and allow her to explain some of her thinking there.
All right. Well, we should grab Devin in here. She's been a trendsetter since I met her, and that was somewhere in the late '90s. But there's a couple of links here to make, right? So I'm not sure how we get into what does Amy Coney Barrett think about telemedicine. That question I don't think was going to be anyone asked. It's unclear what she thinks about gravity. So as to what that's a factor. So let's get on. But there is a link, right, between what you just said, Vince, and what JL and Devin started with, which is the health of hospitals and finance, because we've got to think about paying people in a different way. And the only statement I think we'd all agree with was that although the way we've been paying hospitals, doctors, and everyone else has been messed up for a long time, the way to fix it was not to have a massive epidemic, which then cut some of them off at the knees with the lack of funding for elective surgery. But on the other hand, there's been 150 odd billion poured out by the Cures Act, and my one of many things that I'm going to note for the week is that late last week, HCA, I didn't say Columbia HCA, but I normally do, HCA paid back 1.6 million that they were given in grants. They paid back a bunch of loans as well, but they made so much money in the first couple of quarters because they managed to cut costs as well as cutting revenue that they actually paid back some of the money they had. So on that, let me hear about your trend setting, Devin.
Well, so the migration of people out of cities, which actually does have implications both for what the electorate's going to look like in the future in the next presidential election, but also in terms of what that does in terms of healthcare, because when people are concentrated in cities, it creates these sort of imperatives around these large academic medical centers located in urban environments, whereas, you know, the rents in San Francisco, in Manhattan, Boston, Chicago to a lesser degree are just tanking, and people are leaving. And so Vince is calling me a trendsetter because I left San Francisco. I'm actually in Calistoga right now, and I'm buying a house in an even smaller town. So you know, I just think it's really interesting. The shape of our cities is going to look wildly different as a result of this pandemic. How long that sort of trend will last is a little unclear, but it will, I think, have pretty seismic effects in terms of healthcare, how we deliver it, how much it costs, and the sort of preeminence, again, of these major academic medical centers in urban areas where the population just may not be there.
So am I
Let me add a little
UTSS?
color, if I may, Matthew.
Please.
Well, first, the important part, I was out with the dogs this morning, hiking in the hills, and listened to a podcast. And the podcaster said, quoted what I found out later was a Harris poll, 39% of people, urban dwellers, 39% of urban dwellers have considered moving to a less populated or less densely populated area. And this poll was taken in April, so I've got to think that the percentage today would be even higher. So that's what made me think about my friend, colleague, Devin, as somebody who's actually not only considered it, but has acted upon it. I mean, I thought that was a remarkable percentage, and this is, you know, what we're seeing with Devin is just a real life example. But you know, how far will this go over the next year or two?
Well, I like to point out that I literally was last night. I own an apartment down the street from where Devin just left, and I had to rent it out again because somebody left. And yes, rents went down a lot, which was the landlord.
I think I read rents have gone down about 20% in San Francisco. Devin, you mean
more than that?
Yeah, 25 to 30. Go ahead.
But
25.
Go on, Jen.
I was going to say 25 to 30% they've gone down, and that still makes them, I think, one of the most expensive places in the world. So that just shows you how outrageous they were.
Yeah.
But I was going to say, the Wall Street Journal also had an article today about the move with the big tech companies allowing people to work from home. And as part of some of that, some organizations are cutting people's salaries when they move to lower cost places. So that's an interesting component of this as well. But I agree. I think people leaving the cities and having more affordable cities has many benefits too, but it's going to have a lot of implications for healthcare delivery as well as just what the cities look and feel like.
Yeah, it's useful also, I think, Matthew, to recognize that there are other mega trends that are reinforcing this move out into the hinterlands. One is the fact that with COVID, it sort of has shined a light on multi-generational families and the competing interests of some of these multi-generational families. Some of the people haven't just moved out to be in a rural area, they've moved out to be closer to parents, or they've moved out to figure out how to get their kids back into schools. 50% of 60-year-olds now have a parent alive. That means that 4-generation families are the norm, not the exception. And 5-generation families, are over 1 million people, over 100 now, are not uncommon. So, you know, one of the questions, whether you're talking about the reimbursement of telemedicine, or whether you're talking about where science is going to take us, one of the issues will be, what do the people, specifically the people and their parents and their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandparents, what do they really want for the investment that they're going to be asked to make in the future? And will it involve human touch? Or can we just bypass that now? Do they no longer need compassion or understanding or partnership? Do they no longer need someone to help them process fear and worry? Is that something that we realistically think can be handled electronically? Or do we even want a society like that where people are no longer in contact with people? These are broader cultural questions, but healthcare, I think, and where we go with it are going to help determine what kind of America we have in the future.
Yeah, I think it's worth having a JL jump in and then Rosemary, because there's a sort of a micro and a macro, what you just said, Mike. And JL actually runs a company doing remote behavioral healthcare. So JL, say a little bit about what Centra does and what you're doing sort of day to day, and then feed back in some of the payment stuff and also how you think people are going to start using these technologies.
Sure. Well, the first thing I would comment, though, is about the real estate issue. So I am a proud Manhattanite coming to you from the Upper West Side. And to some extent, I'm appreciating the increased elbow room. It's actually been nice to have fewer people around. Obviously, there are real economic implications to not having those people here. And I don't know how sustainable this is. But as someone who came to New York, I moved to New York in 1988 for college. And I've seen the arc, this 30-year arc of New York becoming more and more crowded. It's interesting to go back to almost how the city felt in 1988 when I first came here. So there is good and bad to people living the city, especially for those of us who are going to try to be survivors here in the post-apocalyptic landscape of New York City.
We're going to see the movie.
We'll send you food rations.
Yeah, no, the movie actually came out already. It's called I Am Legend, and I'm Will Smith in that movie.
That one. Russell was in one, right? Escape from New York. That's
Escape from New York. That is a classic film. Unfortunately, filmed not in New York, in St. Louis, actually East St. Louis. But I actually saw that a couple summers ago. Film Forum had it, and I saw it, and that's a great film. In any case, going back to what Matthew was alluding to, I run a service called Centra Modern Recovery. What we do is we provide virtual concierge, drug and alcohol rehabilitation services to people with substance use disorders. Right now, our business is entirely virtual. And, people with substance use disorders, whether it be alcohol or opiate use disorders, have a very chronic condition. And the patients that we take care of, the patients that I'm, let's say, providing medication-assisted treatment for, I will interact with them over the course of a month. I might interact with somebody 20 times a month. I might have 2 televisits. I might do a bunch of phone calls. I might do texts as well. This morning, I was texting with all of my all the patients that I work with. So, the issue with, I think people are looking at telemedicine as a panacea to fix healthcare, but I think telemedicine is just another tool and just another interface for patients to interact with providers. And again, there are other interfaces. Email is an interface, text is an interface, sensors are an interface. And the problem that we have is that the way we pay for healthcare is, we get paid on a widget basis. So the healthcare that I provide to my patients, if I was going through a traditional third-party payer, this would be much more expensive than what I had provided in previous months, because again, I'd be billing for each individual interaction. The payer doesn't really make a big distinction between a telehealth visit, a phone call, or a text. So the way we solve that problem is patients pay us directly on a monthly basis. They pay us like a subscription. So for me, it's the ultimate value-based care. If our customers don't like what we're doing, they just cancel. And, it really puts a lot of pressure on me or encourages me, incentivizes me to help patients get through all the issues that they have to get through in all the different ways they might try to interact with me. And I think the lesson that I take is that if we really want to move forward to a new kind of healthcare system, yes, it's great to have access to all these new technologies, but unless we fundamentally change the way we pay, and I think we have to change the payment, at least for chronic conditions, it's got to be prospective-based payment. It's got to be, it's got to be based on a unit of time rather than a unit of interaction. I think we're just going to fall right back to the system that we had before. And it's interesting, I've talked to many people, many doctors, many people who are pretty senior at health systems, and they all say, in steady state, they think that virtual is going to be like 20 or 25% of their business, which to me is very, very low. I think for chronic conditions, even substance use disorders, I think virtual can be 90% of the care that you provide. And I think that the problem that these large centers have is, they've built all this bricks and mortar, they have all these fixed costs, they have to get people back into these institutions, or else, something very bad is going to happen. So I think there's that tension, between fee for service and sort of value-based type payment systems. And I'm living in that more value-based future world. And I think a lot of the big health systems are trying to take us back to where we were before.
So before I get to Rosemary, I got to interject because I wrote a piece about this just this week. Humana came out with their sort of report of how they've been doing with their value-based care. And basically it said that they put of their Medicare Advantage members, about 4 million, about 2/3 of them were in what they call value-based care, and about 1/3 of them were in basically just still fee-for-service of their Medicare Advantage members. And then they went, well, it's fantastic. We did all this great work. We paid all these, especially for our capitated groups, we paid them in a whole different way. They had few hospitalizations, on and on, all the great stuff they did. And they said, by the way, we've saved, we think, 20% over the regular fee-for-service Medicare. And that's, that was $4 billion or some big number. Then they actually said, then they had the wrinkle, the one they put it in the chart they didn't want you to see, which was the difference between their value-based care under their Medicare Advantage and their fee-for-service group. And that difference was less than 1%. And I went, hang on, you're doing all this strang and boom and don't, get together, paying all these different ways, and all this complicated stuff, and you're putting money in Heal and Oak Street and Dispatch and all the things you might have done, and you're saving less than 1% by putting the same people in a random fee-for-service program. That doesn't compute. So I'm, having been a proponent of this value-based care and capitation for many, many years, I'm kind of worried about what it's looking like in the real world. All right, I'll shut up, because I agree with you, Jay. We're not going to use technology properly if we're paying by piecework and appealing to Seema Verma for us to pay a few bucks more for each telehealth visit. That's not going to move the needle. But we also don't know if doing it this new way is going to move the needle either.
Sure. And the thing that I would just always say, and this gets back to, concepts of disruptive innovation, Clayton Christensen, is the existing players have business models that are intimately tied to physical presence, seeing people, having people to come to see you. And I do not believe that the healthcare system of the future is going to come out of the New York Presbyterians or the Mount Sinai's of New York, right? It's going to be the One Medicals of the world, the City MDs that have fundamentally different business models, although even those business models are still very much in-person driven. I think those are going to be the new players of the future rather than the existing legacy players.
Rosemary, we've been trying to get to you for a long time. So we had a macro question. You've written a book about macro stuff, but you look at macro stuff too. So,
well, so there's so many interesting threads here. I was about to talk about how the trend to moving out of cities and the burgeoning of this telehealth option, accelerated pace that nobody would have imagined pre-pandemic because our pace of change is so slow. I want to talk about that, but I'm also kind of struggling with something that I heard from one of those large hospital systems that said, we thought we were going to build X. Now we've been through this COVID surge and, we're all worried about another one coming, and we needed Y. And so we are now revisiting our plans because they were thinking that they needed less bricks and mortar because of the way that things were moving, satellite and what have you. And then this whole scariness of the surge and not having capacity is kind of causing another whole way of thinking. And then when people say this, I'm just trying to live through this pandemic, but, when they float out there that, well, we may see another one, like, what? It's not going to be 100 more years. What does that mean? And so I don't have the answer for that yet, but that's floating around in my head. That said, I do think that the promise of telehealth, and I tend to focus on the vulnerable populations, and we work with community health centers and rural, if there are more folks of means who start moving to, out of big cities and have their expectations that I'm going to get the health care I got in the big city, but I can get it here because you guys have the technology to make it happen and you'll figure out the payments. But I, as a consumer, am going to demand this, that, satellite areas are going to have to kind of probably up their game to a certain extent. So that's what I'm thinking about. I wish we could accelerate the changes to our payment mechanisms to keep pace with how much telehealth has accelerated.
I mean, it's worth pointing out though that we've also seen some significant changes in just how we treated COVID. Since, Joe, when you were sick back in February and March,
True.
most people were getting on ventilators, who were already sick, getting on ventilators. Now we're giving very special, important people experimental drugs that cure them completely.
Matthew, I've got a...
But it's worth noting the Chinese built a bunch of hospitals in Wuhan in a week, right? They put up, essentially, they built new buildings in hospitals. If we back in 1918 to 1920, the flu was done by 1920. After 2 years, it was done, and then we were off to the Roaring '20s, or we moved back to the cities, had a good time. We don't know that that's not going to happen here. And if you change your hospital planning now, that new hospital wing you're going to build, which is going to be COVID ready, isn't going to be ready for 5 years in our current state. So I'm not sure how much COVID is going to influence that or should influence that. Sorry, Vince, you're trying to get in.
Yeah, so I'd like to add the view from the hospital, having spent 10 years in a delivery system. That was many years ago, but the economics really haven't changed. John Luke mentioned it, but I'm going to highlight it around this idea of how fixed costs really affect the hospital business. Strata Decisions estimated, or they're telling hospitals, you got to be thinking about, even when this is over, living at 90 to 95% of normal. And today they're down about 20% in inpatient utilization. So think about your own budget. You have fixed costs, things that don't go away, that are there regardless of whatever your salary is, and you're living hand to mouth. You've got to pay your mortgage, your car payments, the electricity isn't going to change. And for the hospital, the analogy of that is you're paying off old buildings. You've got the CAT scanner and the MRI and new equipment to buy. And you've got a very complex organization to staff that you've got to staff 7 by 24 by 365. And even when I was in the IDS, the hospital industry, the mantra was cut costs, and that's been the mantra for the last 30 years. I don't see where, what costs there are left to cut. So if you're living on a 2 to 3% margin and you now have 10% revenues, wow, you're again scared spitless with where where the world is. And now you've also got to be investing in this new digital technologies. It's a really scary position to be in.
Yeah, I go back and forth, right? Because I've started keeping a spreadsheet, which I'm trying to get some other people interested in keeping now, which is how much these big hospital systems have got in reserves, and it's a lot, right? And they all got paid money out of the CARES Act. They haven't really dipped into those. Even Sutter, which allegedly lost $500 million.
Absolutely right. The 2 to 3% margin is an average, and there's a big spread with a quartile of hospitals that are sitting on tons of cash, and I think still whining about the utilization losses. But I think John Luke points out there are a lot of hospitals in middle America that are the major employer in their town, and their next nearest hospital may be 50 miles away, and they're the ones that are suffering the most.
And by the way, let's not forget, a lot of those in some parts of some states, and we'll go back to Rosemary, get to some of the stuff you talked about last time, Ron. A lot of those in some states have benefited because of Medicaid expansion, and the ones that weren't in the Medicaid expansion states didn't benefit from that. And now we have coming up on November 10th, hearing about whether there's going to be an Affordable Care Act. By the way, so let's talk about that for a second. Okay, we have had. I think it is completely comical that, as Sheldon Whitehouse pointed out, which is a tremendous speech he gave during the hearing, is 20 minutes about how dark money has influenced the judiciary, especially the federal courts and the Supreme Court, and how there's been 80 cases that were won 5-4 by the conservatives that have broken down things like, regulation, the regulatory authority of government agencies, and have broken down things like, essentially have allowed voter suppression, all that kind of stuff. But it's just hysterical that we have this thing where for 3 days, Amy Coney Barrett denies that, and this is not the first time, right? Denies she has any opinions on anything at all ever. And has any thoughts. So I'm going, we know why you're put up there.
No, Matthew, I mean, I think we have created an expectation around judicial candidates that they have views on things. And actually, for judicial candidates, they're not supposed to have views on things.
But Devin,
they are supposed to judge the cases in front of them. No, they don't. But I think that a lot of this is the politicization of the process. Now, I want to put Kavanaugh to the side, because I think his candidacy had a lot of concerns associated with it. That had not as much to do with his political views, but lots of other things. In 1986, Justice Antonin Scalia was confirmed by the Senate on a vote of 98-0. 98-0. He had always been a conservative jurist, a strict constructionist, but the expectation was if you were qualified to sit in judgment, in other words, you had the legal chops, you had experience as a justice, you didn't have any sort of significant character flaws, you got confirmed. Your personal opinions about various issues were not relevant. And I do think that even though there are many things in Amy Coney Barrett's writings with which I would personally disagree, I cannot say that she's not qualified to sit on the Supreme Court. This is where elections matter, right? And why it's so important that if if a strict constructionist is not your cup of tea, you've got to sort of vote the people who vote these folks into positions of judicial positions of power accordingly. Like it is like they look at the language, and if the language doesn't allow them to go any further, then they go. That's where they go. If you don't like the way that the law is, it's actually Congress and the administration is where you're supposed to go to get that fixed.
That is true. That is so true. I think so she may be eminently qualified, and we're not really going to know her views, because what she said about the ACA was on a different aspect than what's actually going to be before the Supreme Court. So that's all true. What is so frustrating is that Mitch McConnell sat on the Merrick Garland nomination, which was almost a year before the election. And now we are less than 3 weeks, and this is being rammed through. That just feels wrong. So that's what, and yes, it goes back to elections matter, but I wish I were voting in Kentucky. I can't. And, I just saw, I don't think I can. I just saw a piece this morning that's like, California, 40 million population, and the way things are set up, the actual kind of like popular vote and how that translates to Electoral College and Senate is somehow getting really out of whack with how things were originally designed. And I think that's a big problem.
So I would say, just to interrupt, Devin's the lawyer here, I'm the political scientist. And I'll tell Devin that it's bullshit, right? You can say what you like about the sanctity of the law and the judicial whatever it states, but it's all crap. Yes, there was a boys' club in the Senate in the 80s, and they elected Scalia. We know the results of that, right? We have, the cataclysmic event of Thurgood Marshall quitting before he died, which basically destroyed America, because it goes all the way through to having Thomas on the court, and then Gore v. Bush, and having another, having another bunch of having a much more right-wing court. We're going to end up with a court that has incredible powers, that is way out of, go back to people, in the rural areas and what have you, is way out of step with way out of step with where most Americans are on most of these issues. And we know that, and that's going to be the case. And the people who put up the dark money, the Koch brothers, they don't give a shit. That's what they wanted, right? They didn't win. They can't win in the Congress. They can only win in the presidency sometimes with the Electoral College, which is like the European Cup away goals rule, which I'll explain to some of you later. A complicated way of deciding who wins something which doesn't make any sense. And that's how it works. That's the hardcore politics of it. And the only difference in the Senate is that people have woken up to that and said, okay, we're going to use and abuse our powers as senators to actually do that. You can say what you like, but the court has always been, at least since the 30s, and I don't know the history for that, it's always been incredibly political, and it's going to keep doing that. And people are going to, you can say she's qualified, not qualified. She's been put in there to do a job.
No, exactly. And obviously, she wouldn't be nominated by this president if they didn't think that they were going to get results out of her that were going to favor them. That's sort of the nature of the process. But the fact that she didn't tell you how she was going to rule on a particular case, like she can't. arguably then she'd have to disqualify herself from voting on the case. So we don't get to know very much about these folks other than, whether, what they did when they drank too much beer when they were in high school, or if they have a strong judicial track record of opinions.
A rhetorical question for all. With tongue in cheek, Devin, how do we go back to 1996 and make it depoliticized? How do we make America great again? And
well, here we go, Vince.
My answer is we got to live with the politicization. That's
entirely
today's
true.
reality.
Maybe there's. Go ahead, Jennifer. You haven't had a chance to talk much.
Maybe when all the city dwellers move to those rural areas, it's going to mess up with all the gerrymandering, and we're going to get a completely different political system.
No one's moving to North Dakota. How many people are moving to Idaho? Enough, maybe, but no one's moving to North Dakota and South Dakota. I mean, this thing's been gerrymandered since 1776. We know that.
Well, yeah. But apparently I now have to call my broker and say I'm moving to Kentucky. Like, forget about the house in California. I'm moving to Kentucky.
What, to vote against?
Kentucky's going to help much.
We can all
get there fast enough
from there.
Yeah, we have to pack the state. Forget about packing the course. Pack the state.
There was a serious question someone wrote. Well, serious, somewhat tongue in cheek. Should somebody set up? If you set up a big enough operation, either a factory or office or whatever, in North Dakota, South Dakota, wherever, you can start moving some of these states around with not very many people. And should you move people? But I mean, this is bonkers if you ask me. But that's what we've got to be real. This is what we've got. Okay. I actually have a bet with Margaret Guerrieri on Twitter. She thinks that it's going to uphold 7-2, the Affordable Care Act on the thing November 10th, and that it's going to be fine, and that it'll and I said. And she's actually bet me $100. If she doesn't get 7 votes to uphold it, she pays me $100. I think it's going down 5-4. I think Roberts will stay with it. The 2 justices who voted against NFIB against 4 or against which one? Who voted to knock it down in 2012? They're the ideological heirs who are Kavanaugh and Gorsuch to the other 2, and Barrett will all vote against it. And I think it goes down either way. But even if she doesn't get confirmed by them, which she will, it's going to be 4-4. In that case, and the thing still gets overturned. So we've got real stuff to go. I mean, I don't know if people are thinking about this. Clearly, the Democrats in the Senate on the Judiciary Committee were thinking about this a lot, and they were bashing on this, and it was been bashed on the debates. But the healthcare system has got to think this is going to be really serious shit if the ACA gets overturned, because it's got as Ian Morrison said, it's got its tentacles in every part of healthcare now.
Well, there wasn't anything really unusual about Amy. She could have been from any Fortune 100 company. She's just corporate. And she got along by going along, and she'll now deliver what she has promised to deliver, and she's been promising for years. So, she didn't come out of nowhere. And the world that she's come from is a corporate world, whether you think it's Notre Dame, or you think it's conservative Catholic, or you think it's this or that. It's not. It's corporate. That's who she is, and that's fine. We had a big debate yesterday with a group of people I'm working with down in Texas, trying to decide, if a Biden were to get elected, should we attempt to do something incremental here? Since we've been blocking Medicaid expansion and so forth, should we do some incremental thing, maybe Medicaid expansion? Or are we entering into an era where fundamental change becomes possible? Should we do something larger? And I think that's going to be one of the challenges ahead. I mean, if they knock out ACA, then, it's nuclear war. But if they don't, and if Biden gets in, there still is a very big question, and that is, are we going to tinker around the edges with this thing? Are we going to basically say, all we got to do is figure out how to pay for the right things? Or are we going to say, hey, look, this thing has no checks and balances that it should have. Nobody ever asked the fundamental question, how do you make America and Americans healthy? We are severely unenlightened when it comes to the way we attempt to provide health to a population. So there are bigger issues. There are like metaphysical issues that have to be addressed, and we've got to sort of stop and ask, what are we trying to create in this country, rather than just add a little bit of value this or some of the telemedicine that. It's so screwed up. You know, you got to get back to really fundamental questions like Canada asked in Saskatchewan in 1947. They asked, how are we going to make all Canadians healthy? That's what they asked. And we never asked that question in this country, so we got what we got.
Well, there's no question, Mike,
Rosemary, can you
we have a messed up healthcare. Go ahead.
Rosemary, jump in, and then we'll go to Vince and then Jen.
Yeah. So I love having the goal be that we actually be healthy. And some people would take that and say, well, then everybody just needs to exercise and eat their veggies, and it's an individual problem. And that's where I want to part company with just saying it should be about the health as a goal, because there are really systemic forces here in play. And the fact that we don't have Medicaid expansion in largely the southern states has a lot to do with the structural racism issues that have been glaringly brought into focus with, the murders of way too many Black people and the pandemic and the disparities there. So there's an underlying dissatisfaction, that would be putting it mildly, anger that has been exacerbated by this pandemic. And you see it with young folks, you see it with a lot of women who are saying enough is enough. So I don't think Biden Harris, if they're elected, can just go and tinker. I do think he's got, they have a healthcare platform that could actually yield far more people covered. And if we could just go back to the 100% federal funding for Medicaid expansion, grandfather in those states, I think we could get there. And that would be huge. We still wouldn't need to have universal coverage, but we would be so much further. And I think, there's a lot of folks who are voting Democrat to the farther left who want to see something real in their version of real happen with this election. And I think that's really important for the Democratic Party.
All right, I'm going to get more here. Jen, can I go Jen, then Mike, then Vince?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would echo everything that Rosemary said. I think people want some dramatic changes right now. Expectations are very high in terms of what's needed to actually fix some of these problems that we all now see front and center, and the racial disparities and the systemic and institutionalized systems that are enforcing those racial disparities, I think is something that people want answers to. They want it from employers, they want it from public health. So I think that we're at a time where if Biden and Harris are elected, they would have the platform to make some pretty dramatic changes. And I think folks would be pretty disappointed with tinkering around the edges.
Mike?
Yeah, and what I would say, Rosemary, is I'm totally aligned with you. I don't view this as a softy exercise in any way. I view this as addressing long overdue social determinants like housing and infrastructure and transportation and security and education, and understanding in a very enlightened way how these impact health and human potential, and doing it through a publicly managed system, not through 1,000 points of light. So I think what we've proven is when you've purposefully dismantled your government, you get this. You get 250,000 people dying. That's what you get for bad government.
Right. And Matthew,
I would like to be the contrarian optimist here. The role that I seem to be dropping into more and more in these conversations. The glass, in my view, is at least a third full. And
that's the optimistic part.
Let me finish, okay? In most other countries, we have largely publicly financed 80 to 90%. In the US, it's about 50%. And we have a mix of a public-private healthcare system. And as a result of COVID, what we're seeing is existing trends vastly accelerated, and I'm seeing tremendous innovation occurring largely in the private sector. That's where I would say the glass is at least a third full.
Joe.
And I am not a political scientist like you, Matthew, but I do have my
That was a
views.
very bad one, so don't worry about it.
I mean, look, I just don't think the U.S. is like a radical change country. I think, the ACA was passed and we fought a 10-year political nuclear war over the ACA that is still unresolved. We're still living in the fallout today. And I think that radical change, even if the Democrats end up with the executive and the legislative branches and unified control, I still don't think you get a radical change. And I think probably what more likely happens, if I had to guess, if I were betting my money, is we take existing public programs. So let's say the ACA is defeated and many people end up getting forced out of the commercial healthcare market. You could easily see Biden and Harris saying, okay, well, we're going to expand Medicare and we're going to expand Medicaid, right? And just the government becomes a bigger part of the payer picture. And, those programs work. People actually like Medicare. Medicare works very well. I can tell you as a provider in another business that Medicare was actually a great payer. So, if I had to game out scenarios, I think it's much more likely that Medicare and Medicaid expand in terms of the number of people that they cover over time, as opposed to any other kind of radical change.
Yeah, I wrote a piece.
You could also, I'm a fan of state-based exchanges and the healthcare.gov platform if it was being run a little differently right now, but you could use infrastructure that's been built and some of the trust that's been built, and you could, even without the official ACA, put things for sale from an expanded Medicare, Medicaid, which could involve private insurers, as Medicare Advantage does, as Medicaid does. So you could see a path there. I was on a panel yesterday. We talked about radical incrementalism, and one of my former bosses, dean of the Harvard Kennedy School, former dean now, that was one of his favorite phrases, and I think that is what our country has at most has the appetite for.
Yeah, I agree with that. And think about how much has changed so quickly and so dramatically in the last 6 months. We can change healthcare faster than we give people credit for.
That's true.
I mean, you say that. I wrote a piece that was a couple of weeks back, which was for what Biden should say the night before the Supreme Court rule, which was basically, if you guys do that, if you knock this thing down, I'm going to go thermonuclear. And it looks like they can expand, I think, and Devin, you'll have to tell me the ruling on this, being the lawyer on the panel, that they can expand Medicare via reconciliation with 50 votes, don't have to go to 60 votes, or they could vote the filibuster, but they could actually expand Medicare down to zero age, and you could theoretically do that. But yeah, it's a huge move. And by the way, Biden has always said he won't do that. He won't commit to anything radical, and he has Kamala Harris staying in the debate that they're not going to ban fracking, which to me is a very minor step towards sort of the new great environmental New Deal, Green New Deal, or whatever we're not going to get out of them either. So there's not a lot of appetite, I think, in that moderate Democratic group to do this. And don't forget, they had 60 votes, not for very long, but they did have 60 votes. And it still was a nightmare to get the ACA, which is, as JL says, is relatively modest incremental change, which now we're fighting over 10 years later. So we might just be in this thing where we can't do anything for a long time. But you got to think that if we couldn't do much after the Great Recession in 08 and 09, and we can't, after now, we'll still be in the recession, which is maybe depression, maybe not. Who the hell knows what it'll be like next year, plus the pandemic. Who knows what we'll be able to do? But you got to
see what happens with the Senate.
Well, I mean, that's the other thing. There's no guarantee. I mean, we're looking at the polls, but we're relying here on, a bunch of people in Iowa and North Carolina and South Carolina who probably haven't returned to Democrat for a damn long time to actually do that. And then assuming that they win Arizona, or the Democrats win Arizona, win Maine, and win Colorado easily, and that can get to 52, 53 seats. But the way the Senate is structured, as we talked with Electoral College, is it's radical. It's not structured at all to favor, a lot of people where most people are, and that's going to be the future of politics for a while, until we take really radical steps and talk about things like getting rid of the Electoral College, getting rid of the Senate, all the stuff that I approve of, but hard to see how we get that. Well, I obviously just believe that there should be one dictatorship and it should be me, but there we go. Mike, we go to you, and then we're going to have to go to our wrap.
Well, one of the things worth thinking about is that we are challenged by extreme complexity, but the complexity has been purposeful. Because the more complex it was, the more people were able to take money out of the system. And so if you're looking at how the opioid epidemic spread, it spread through opacity and complexity. If you look at PBM profiteering right now, it is successful because of complexity. If there is an overwhelming support for universal coverage and for a comprehensive set of benefits, as there is, the way one would approach that is by offering something superior to what we have. And frankly, that's not that hard to do. And if the major issue is complexity, then the major solution is simplicity. That is eliminating non-real jobs, eliminating useless steps, eliminating non-clinical care. That's the way back in. So all I'm saying is, it's really not so much about building plenty of money in the system, plenty of steps. It's about eliminating the steps that don't count. And that's doable.
Which though will run into what JL was saying earlier about hospitals as employers and the money in the health system. I mean, yeah, changing radical complexity is difficult. I think we all agree. And we're going to see whether there's appetite for that next year, maybe. But again, only possible if we have the Democratic win that some of us think we're going to get. But even so, we're 3 weeks out, and I don't think anyone has any certainty on any of this stuff. So it's going to be interesting. All right, we're almost at the top of our hour. We've had a great conversation. I don't think we've solved any problems this week, but we've certainly touched on many. So I'm just going to go around the gang and ask people what they're thinking, what they're going to see in the next. I'll let you stretch out to 3 weeks or even 4 maybe, because then we get past the election. So what do you expect to see in the next couple of weeks plus? I'll start with you, Jen.
Oh, too many political ads. I'm in Colorado right now visiting family, and it is insane, the number of ads. So I think it's just going to be all about the election the next few weeks, and then we'll hope that it's actually resolved the first week of November.
Fair enough. Mike?
I think we're going to see more public people become COVID positive, and that may throw some wrinkles into this.
Vince?
Keep it simple. Once again, please vote. Please vote early. Please don't vote often.
Okay, so Rosemary's not going to move to Illinois then. Rosemary.
What's that?
I said you're not going to move to Illinois. Isn't that way? Is it Illinois, Louisiana, or both ways?
No, it was Kentucky.
Kentucky?
But it's Kentucky. It has Mitch McConnell's up for re-election.
Yeah, but you can't. But it's Illinois that you vote early and vote often, right?
Oh, gotcha. Sorry, I was referencing.
I was rerouting you.
Okay, so the election, and I think the early voting has just been unbelievable. And so getting a gauge on, exit polling, I guess, from early voters is going to become a thing, which will be very interesting, and the likes of which we haven't seen. So people are saying it's not really election day the way we used to think of it. It's like that should be that's the deadline for voting, but it's not the same as like voting. So that's a shift. I'll say that, and I'll just throw in one more, which is I do think you look at the endorsement of Biden by entities, whoever led with that piece in their observation, that it's kind of unprecedented, but these magazines that have done that, I do think we're going to see a little more of that in the coming weeks as well.
Where are we? Devin?
I hope that we'll see some regulations that we've been anticipating out of HHS around the information blocking rule deadline, and some modifications to HIPAA, because frankly, I need to be doing something other than making myself crazy over worrying about this election. So please give me some regs to read, because I need them. Thank you.
Never needs to go back to her day job. JL?
I think, building on what Rosemary and Vince said, I think we're finally starting to see the scientific community say enough bullshit. We need to stop with what we're doing in terms of how we're managing this pandemic, because we have royally screwed up our management of this pandemic since the beginning. And I think you're seeing the head of the CDC, the head of the FDA, all these, journal boards saying we need scientists up front. We don't need political hacks telling us how we can manage this pandemic. And as somebody who was sick for a month, I mean, this is very personal to me. And I think, after the deaths of more than 200,000 Americans, probably 300,000 in sometime soon, we have to get this under control. The scientists have to stand up for themselves and cannot allow themselves to be manipulated politically. So that's what I'm looking for.
I think it's a very, very somber and a sensible note on which to end. So with that point, we're going to end the THCB gang for this week. I want to thank my guest, and he should come up in a second. Jen Benz from Siegel Benz, Rosemary Day from Day Health Strategies, JL Neptune from Center Modern Recovery, and New York, staying in New York City bravely. Vince Carradis, not staying in New York City, but in the wilds of Idaho. Mike McGee, author of Code Blue. You'll see his THCB book club appearance show up next Wednesday. And Deb McGraw, used to say from San Francisco, but now from the wilds of Sonoma County. So congratulations on the move, Deb. All right, thanks a lot for watching the THCB gang. We'll be back same time, same back channel next week, 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern on Thursday. And we're getting ever closer to what the hell is going to happen on the election day. Bye for now.